So last January, not last month, but in 2020, which, my gosh, feels like eons ago, I found myself on an airplane to Los Angeles to meet a number of other clergy around the country to learn for 3 days from a place called Homeboy Industries and a priest in the Catholic tradition named Father Greg Boyle. And we found ourselves going each morning to be in devotion with both volunteers and servants from all over that big city, celebrities, different people that you might recognize. But more importantly, we found ourselves sitting at the feet from the wisdom that has been lived of those that found themselves in gang activity for years, if not decades of their lives, many of them in prison, many of them struggling with addiction, and yet they found themselves to have healing and wholeness and to have a whole new lease on life through their experience at Homeboy and their multiplicity of different opportunities to connect and to live and grow dignity that was already there in their hearts. Two of the people that I met and heard giving testimony were Anthony and Boris. Now, these were both Hispanic men that actually were on different sides of the aisle, let's say. They were in two different gangs on the east and west side of the city. And these two men came into the program about the same time. And one of the big mottos, if you will, or I would say core value that they hold together is the best way to put down a gun with a bullet is to give a person a job. And so these two guys found themselves, knew each other real well from seeing each other on the streets in different experiences over the years. They found themselves both standing in a bakery. Now, if you can imagine, of course, there was suspicion all over the place each day they were interacting with each other. But day after day, month after month, trust grew. To the point where over the years that they had worked through the program and then become leaders as strong men in that programming, bringing others behind them, one of the guys, Anthony, who was about to get married, let Boris know he didn't have a choice. He was going to be his best man. And as I heard this story of two men that found themselves with bullets in their hands, to being in a bakery, to then becoming true brothers in every sense of the word, I couldn't help but allow the tears to flow from my eyes. And of course it was because of the story, but it was more than that. It was the realization in hearing their heartfelt witness speaking truth in life that I realized these two men in front of me were so much more set up for health and hope in their life than I ever was in my present state of being. Being a privileged white girl from a reasonably well-to-do city in Louisiana, had all the resources I could ever want, and I just had the luck of, let's say, being born in the right zip code and the right school district where I didn't get crossways with too much trouble. Found myself thinking that over the years, I and people like me, maybe even you, those that are hearing the sound of my voice this morning, find ourselves pretty guarded and perhaps even resistant from admitting that we actually have a problem. And these men, because their problems were kind of in the public sphere and had gone through the court system and had found them with a rap and a record, they had no choice but to admit that and then come face to face with their humanity. But so many of us find ourselves gliding, in fact, on autopilot through our lives, thinking that at least on the outward projection of what we offer the world, we can delude everyone of those points in us that are unfinished, that are hurting, that are perhaps in fact angry or feeling betrayed. And those of us that find ourselves completely broken, not knowing where to turn for the healing that we know that, at least in the quiet moments of our lives, we need. Maybe we are resistant to admitting that there is a problem because of what it might actually require of us. Those people over there are the ones that are supposed to actually give up their lunch period to go do a 12-step program. Those people over there that have legit problems are the ones that need to make an investment for counseling. Maybe we're resistant because of the courage and the honesty, the sacrifice of time and personal risk that it may ask us to engage. We all have limitations to some degree, to how much risk we can take, how much we can stomach, how much we can stand. No matter what, that has been true for human beings throughout time, if only we will admit it. If you watched our Ash Wednesday service, which, gosh, I regretted not being able to see you in person outside of our sanctuary on that day. I'm glad you stayed at home safe. And if you found yourself engaging with us on that day through our online offering, you'll know that I said, and I will say again and forever, that we have been living a year of Lent. 365 days almost of unbelievable sacrifice and pivoting from what is normal. Graduations and weddings, plans and dreams. Normal Thursday night happy hours that give us life and joy and help us laugh. Whatever it is, we have been reminded of our mortality and our impermanence in a way that makes most of us beyond uncomfortable. So it's not news to us this time. It doesn't come to us like a slap in the face from Mardi Gras saying, "Oh, we're dust?" This year, oh, yeah, we're dust. The tone of that acceptance is completely different this year, maybe for the first time in your life and in my life. We are painfully aware. There are some around us that don't have the luxury of considering that really in all of the pain that they have seen and the suffering that they have known, that they are not dust. They've been reduced to dust and have actually lived somehow to tell the tale. But again, for guys like Boris and Anthony, they know and are able to admit what is true. That God doesn't always protect us from the hard things in life, but always sustains us in everything. So that's part of what we are going to be walking through over these next weeks as we talk about the commitment and, in fact, the discipline, maybe even the sacrifice of kinship in the human condition and what it may bring to us as a surprise during this season when we lean in. We're largely going to be walking through the work of Father Greg Boyle, Barking to the Choir, Rediscovering Kinship. And I know some of you have picked up that book to read those stories. Man, it is one of the best books you'll read that isn't one of those heavy ones that's hard to get through. It's really actually hard to put down. And so I hope that when you feel led, even if it's not in this season, another time, keep it in your mind to grab it at some point as a part of your bookshelf of all things spiritual to hold for the years to come. But Father Greg talks about our human propensity to settle for the separate and small in our struggle in life for kinship, when there is so much more in life to find. He says this: human beings are settlers, but not in the pioneering sense. It is our human occupational hazard to settle for little, he says. We settle for purity and piety when we are being invited to an exquisite holiness. We settle for the fear-driven things when love longs to be our engine. We settle for a puny, vindictive God when we are being nudged always closer to this wildly inclusive, larger than any life God. We allow our sense, he says, of God to atrophy. We settle for the illusion of separation when we are endlessly asked to enter into kinship for all. So I want us to think about this a little bit. Man, it is such a hard and amazing thing, like Sherry said, the week that we have gone through from the shores of Mississippi all the way through Louisiana and Texas. We have been on the struggle bus in ice and storm with power grid failures, sometimes statewide, having to boil water to be able to flush toilets, and of course, freezing sometimes in 40-degree weathers within our living rooms. We have all been locked up together. We have all been, many of us, having to rely on the kindness of strangers or extend our own resources if we are in a place of comfort beyond our desiring. And all the while, you see story after story of the helpers, people galvanized to help each other and to fill needs and to send pallets after pallets of bottled water and to do what they can to make sure people, in fact, even survive, as there are many of those that in another disaster in the same year or series of months have died. It made me think of a story that Kate Bowler brought up of a very famous theologian, Dorothy Day. She's in the Catholic tradition. Some of you may have studied her, or at least been exposed to her work and her writings. And she was a Catholic theologian, labor organizer, among other things. She really lived life beyond what more spiritual thinkers often did. And compared to all of her contemporaries, R.H. and Reinhold Niebuhr, so many of these big names, she was one of the only ones of her time in the early 1900s that didn't talk about the desire to overcome our circumstances, as if suffering, being dust, being on the edge of survival was actually something that was foreign to us. She had exposure enough to know that that's a thing in life, and that the Lord does give and the Lord does take away. There was an acceptance to that, even the things that happen by chance in the natural world. She, in fact, even when she was 6 years old, experienced an earthquake in California where she lived in 1906. And she was reflecting on the disaster so much more like we have been in this disaster of ice and snow and then the storms of our previous fall. And she, in her little voice of curiosity at such a young age, gave an important theological question that we need to continue to hold during Lent, among each other, but during all times. Why aren't we always like this, she said, with the helpers ready to offer what they can? Why are these situations specific? Why is it not a daily practice pouring out from who we are and the way that we live? Indeed, why aren't we always like this? We see it portrayed in the movies as a commitment we value, Certainly something that is even appreciated because it comes up again and again in the theme. Whether it's movies about military battalions in war with all of the unsuspecting characters that come from different sides of the tracks, different walks of life, and then they find themselves not only committed to the task before them, but committed to the people around them too, for their survival and even their thriving. I think of a little bit more of a less serious situation, but one that may be held in the hearts of every Gen Xer like myself. A movie from the mid-1980s that we know well. It's of 5 young people that found themselves quarantined together on a Saturday morning in detention for all sorts of different infractions or reasons, or just being sullen. From the popular girl to the shy one that was super awkward, to the jock, to the bully, to the brain, whoever it was, they realized after breaking down some of their self-made barriers, in fact, self-made violence to their internal personhood, they began to admit what was really there, not only in their own hearts, but in their realities. The peer pressure and the abuse and the struggle that they went through with their parents and in poor relationships with friends. These students realized that despite their differences, they all faced a similar reality, again, of brokenness, of a need for healing, and of impermanence. So, to their vice principal's request for each of them to write a letter as to what they believe they are for, who are they? Instead of writing 5, they wrote 1. As to who they thought they were, signed the Breakfast Club. And again, it's all of these offerings and stories and parables about what life is and perhaps what we hope life would be that we hold to us, and they don't always bear out in our everyday living. Not speaking this from a point of shame, but simply from a point of fact that we should consider. So, these experiences are often situational, often temporary, perhaps because we talk about compassion fatigue, those times where we only have so much to give before we retreat back into our bunker. But God has huddled us, unusual suspects, in different places to weather the storms of life in all times, and even in the stories that speak truth beyond literal truth, from the story of Noah. And of course, this is a story that many of us know from our children's Bibles, from Sunday school, and often it is left behind once we graduate into the more complex and the more interesting of the Bible. But as I've continued to mine through Noah and the surface treatment that we give the story, there is always more to see. You may not have noticed in our focus on the 2x2 and which animals got to go inside of the ark with Noah and his family as God prepared to give the earth a new start, shall we say, in the most positive way that we possibly can. Beyond all of that treatment, I noticed in studying the whole of Scripture, not just chapter 9 that Steve read for us, but in the whole of the story, that in chapter 7 at the beginning, in verse 2, we see this, that as God gathered both humans and animals 2x2, the Scripture says, "You shall take with you 7 of each and every clean animal, a male and female, 2 of each animals also that are unclean, a male and his female." Maybe that's a new one for you. It's one that I had forgotten. And yet still, when those studying Scripture in the scrolls of old and then even into this day and time, it might seem just almost scandalous that God would include unclean animals in this huddle from the storm and the whole destruction of the world if they were not to be tampered with or not seen as ones that are holy. Yet still, they are included in God's family, in God's economy, in fact, in God's adoption to the world, the earth, creation 2.0. Wonder for us what that says about our present experience. In near ancient philosophy and religious thought and practice, this whole story of Noah felt so much like the stories of many other religions where the turbulent and tumultuous waters of their time were ones that spoke truly to chaos being brought again to peace. And really, God allowed this flood to come, the chaos to ensue. And after all of the waters had swept away everything that had been built, and they subsided, and then they were left with the ark to start a new thing, God saw that creation, in fact, did not change as God had hoped. Maybe there was some part of God that knew that that would be the case already, and there would have to be a different way of bringing a peace-filled creation into the world in a way that would stick. And so, in the wake of destruction, in the wake of a new canvas to be able to paint on with all of creation, human beings, animals, all that would have dominion over the earth, God did put God's bow in the sky, the war bow that was used for destruction or for overtaking any power. He put it in the sky and said, I will see it now and be the God who remembers. And God made a new covenant with an unchanging, stiff-necked people. As Chuck Reagan said, he said this, and I've just kind of held this to my heart because it resembles so many of us. He says of himself, as we talk about creation, I know one person better than I know any other. And if that's any indication, we are all in trouble. God knew that in this covenant that God made, putting really a restraining order on God's self, limiting his powers to do anything like this again, he had to actually ask humanity not to continue to rely on God to solve all of their problems. That instead of looking up, we had to look across and down. And among those around us, whom we call biological and chosen family, our adopted kin. I know it would be easier to start over. Lord knows, over these past 2 years, it'd be great to just press the easy or reset button. But God knows, and at some deep level, so do we, that to start over robs us of the opportunity to develop the muscle memory of kinship and to learn and work through the struggles right in front of us to make peace among us in the world that truly lasts. And so we have to see it through, and it's going to require us to deepen a commitment, or for some of us, truly start a commitment to kinship in life and all that it might call us to risk or to see anew, to create a peace that would be accomplished, built, and made and tended through a different means than creating a simple ark might with an easy instruction booklet. This work of kinship is not easy at all. In fact, complex and hard to grasp, but we know it exactly when we find it in our lives. Why kinship? Because it fulfills God's dream. It fulfills even the invitation, in fact, the command that Jesus gave us throughout his ministry that we would become one. It is drawing an endless circle of compassion with no one, in fact, no one standing outside of it. It requires us to claim a new home for ourselves. Thomas Wolfe, in a poem that's called You Can't Go Home Again, he writes, "To lose the earth you know for greater knowing, to lose the life you have for a greater life, to leave the friends you've loved for greater loving, to find a land more kind than home, more large than even earth." It's a whole different kind of belonging that we experience that brings new color and, in fact, new humor for another day. Father Boyle told us a story that you can find in the Barking to the Choir book as well. He talked about all the different businesses that Homeboy Ministries has created, again, to tend kinship in the lives of those that are trying to build a new one. And in one of their restaurants, Homegirl Cafe, the Oscar-winning actress Diane Keaton, who some of you may know from different movies like Annie Hall and others, Diane Keaton came in with a friend and she sat down at the table, again, not announcing her presence. She came in, looked at the menu, and the homegirl that was her waitress, Glenda, had approached the table with her tattooed and felon parolee self, and she asked, "What do you want?" And Diane asked, "Well, I'm looking at this menu and I'm wondering what you would suggest." And so Glenda, of course, gave a few suggestions with 3 different platillos that she would say that are the best ones from her mind on the menu. And Diane Keaton says, "Okay, I'll have the second one. That sounds great." And then Glenda had this moment of recognition looking at Diane's face, and she said, "You know, I gotta know you from somewhere. Your face looks so familiar." And Diane, in a really humble tone, she said, "Well, I guess I just have one of those ordinary faces that most people think they recognize." And Glenda said, "Wait a minute. I know. You and I were locked up together." In Lent, in this time where we do remember that we all find ourselves coming from dust, we are called to work on this commitment to kinship, not just in how we see and how we think, but how we act and who we surround ourselves with. To allow love to be the very tender and vulnerable and connective tissue that binds us for the times when we are worn thin, for the times when our weak places are exposed. The old wounds are there for the breathing, the unspoken resentments and betrayal and anger that drive us to yell or to pull back. In times where we fall short, in times, maybe even this time, where we don't have the energy to meet in the middle or to meet at all. We all are facing some kind of battle today in our finiteness that is hidden by a well-crafted and curated exterior of self-sufficiency that we project conveniently to the world. But God's purpose in this time of returning and reconnection is for a world to be unified that remains in conflict, not just with the warring nature of humanity, but with the warring nature of every human heart. Kinship, Father Boyle says, always exposes the game that we play if we let it. So I'll end with Greg's words. Only in kinship, inching ourselves closer to creating that community of kinship such that God might recognize it. This is the work of the holy. Soon we imagine with God this circle of compassion, and then we imagine no one standing outside of that circle, no one being outside of the margins, and no one being erased. We stand there with those whose dignity has been denied. We locate ourselves at the edges and join with the despised and the readily left out, the demonized, so that the demonizing will stop. We situate ourselves right next to the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. Friends, as we face this imbalance without and within head on, my prayers are with you that you will open your eyes, look within, pay attention, and allow yourself to be fully open to the work of healing and wholeness that is for you and for me. May it be so. Amen.